All right. Good afternoon, LinkedIn. Woohoo! We're so excited about this one. Can't believe how many of you have signed up for this. Clearly, hot button topic. And I'm with three incredible fundraisers today who've made their career in this wonderful, slightly wacky field. And I'm just thankful for all of you who've joined us today. And we're really raring to go on this conversation. So I'm going to kind of do a round robin. I'd love if everybody just did a quick introduction of who they are and a little bit about their nonprofit background and fundraising. So, Christina, this was inspired by a conversation with you that we had a couple months ago. So I'm going to let you go first and jump in on who you are.
Thanks, Tasha. Everybody, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever in the world you are. I'm Christina Martin-Kenny. I have been a fundraiser my entire career in the nonprofit space, and I am just deeply passionate about supporting this sector in keeping fundraisers and when you write a grant, they always ask you, what is your organization doing to maintain sustainability? And the answer is never about staffing retention. And over my career as a contract grant writer, as a consultant, as a director of development, holding a lot of in-house and out-of-house roles, and now holding both of those roles simultaneously as a consultant and a director of development, I have just become really vocal and really, really passionate about the fact that the only way I see this sector really achieving the change it needs to is if the sustainability question is answered by supporting fundraisers and all staff, but supporting staff internally. So that's me. Thanks everybody for being here.
Hey, awesome. Betsy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Betsy Purves. My current title is Director of Institutional Advancement, which means something different at every organization you go to. I got started because I'm a classically trained singer, but knew I wasn't good enough to perform, even if I had wanted to. So I started off interning at different music organizations because I still wanted to work in music, in the arts. And that's how I fell into fundraising. And I loved it from the get-go, from one of my college internships. So have been working at small and mid-size organizations for the last 15 years. And it turns out I really love managing and mentoring. So that's the lens that I come to this with. Is absolutely from what Christina was saying, retention, but also how do we create encouraging spaces for new fundraisers to come up in.
Absolutely. I think that's what I see as the concern right now is the burnout and who's going to take on some of these really critical roles. And I know that that's been part of the inspiration. Marina, can you introduce yourself as well?
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Marina Muñoz de Martínez. I use she, her, ella, titi pronouns, and I'm just so excited to be in space with y'all today. My background, I've also been doing fundraising and philanthropy for over 20 years. And one of the reasons why I was excited to join this conversation is honestly one of my first, I think my internship in 2002 in the development and marketing office of Boys and Girls Clubs of San Francisco. One of my earliest experiences was during an economic downturn and listening to funders recalibrate their giving priorities. And I think about that and the 20 plus years that I've seen in various situations happen since then. My experience also includes a lot of arts and most recently racial justice, where I spent 4 years with Race Forward, helping build a comprehensive giving program for an organization historically underfunded. So I say that to say I've got a lot of thoughts and feelings and real meaningful impact to bring to this conversation, because most importantly, what I like to bring to this conversation is the fact that I consider us social scientists, my friend, and I'm really excited to lean in on that conversation with y'all today.
Love that. Some lovely comments. The lovely Megan Whitney jumping in. Thanks for being here, Megan. Kathy, Chelsea. I would love if people would throw, a little bit about what their role is, what they're doing in the nonprofit world into the comments. We are paying attention. Our wonderful panelists today have said that if you kind of have questions as we're relevantly working through the conversation, we'll try to bring those in real time or get them at the end. But this is a big conversation today. And so we're going to jump right in here because it's going to be, I'm super excited to see what everyone has to say and all of your thoughts for the people listening. So we're going to jump this off, and I'm going to throw it out first to Christina. But, we talk about the unicorn, not only unicorn nonprofits that maybe are great for fundraisers, but what about the unicorn roles that we're asking nonprofiteers to cut, like, fundraisers to take on? How can you be an amazing grant writer and also plan an event and be a donor stewardship professional? Like, how do we do all of that? And is it realistic to expect that in one individual?
Yeah, this is so important. I think job descriptions for fundraising staff, specifically directors of development and chief development officers, have become, I joke, a CVS length receipt. If those of you know what CVS is, you know what I'm talking about, but just 30, 40 bullet descriptions of event planning to grant writing to donor stewardship to major gifts, everything. And I look at these, and you're not hiring a director of development, you are hiring an entire department. And no one person can do all of those things well. I've been in the fundraising space for over 15 years, and I am a terrible event planner. It is not my skill set, but the number of galas I have been asked to plan with no support, and then I'm just trying to figure this all out at the same time, right? Grant writers, and I've been a grant writer, I consider myself an extroverted, but you have some grant writers that are introverted people who don't want to be out there soliciting major gifts. So you really truly are looking for a unicorn when you're expecting somebody to be and do all of these things. And, whenever I post about this on LinkedIn, I get feedback about, well, these are director level roles. Nobody's actually expecting somebody to do all of those things. Their job is to direct all of those things. And yes, in theory, but I've been a development team of one. I know most small organizations, you've got somebody doing development and marketing and, who else knows what else. And I think the challenge when you expect one person to be everybody is they can't do it all at once. When I was a director of development as a development team of one, in one day, I would be writing tax receipts to $5 donors while meeting with a donor soliciting a 5-figure gift. And in between, writing grants and planning an event. And nobody can specialize and do any of these things well. And I think that that's one thing that higher ed gets really, really right. I've spent some time in higher ed, is they hire these hyper specialized, you have a planned giving expert, you have a major gifts person, you have an annual giving person. And while small nonprofits don't have the resources and the capacity to hire that many people, you just can't do everything. Maybe your organization forgoes direct mail. Maybe your organization forgoes the gala in favor of building a robust digital monthly giving program. I don't know what it is, but I think these organizations really need to sit down and look at these 40 points and say, do we actually need all of these? Can we actually need all of these? What are the ones we need to be focused on that are going to give us the highest return on our investment, and who can we hire that can do those things well?
Absolutely. Marina, what would you add to this, especially, with the racial justice and equity lens roles you've had most recently? How does that kind of play into that trying to do everything in one role?
I mean, honestly, it for me, part of this again lands with what I named already. Seeing us in our role in our work, we're social scientists, right? I love talking about higher education because I spent a long time working in higher education, and you're right. It's a machine, and it's a machine that understands that in the social science of fundraising, we need specialization, and we have specialization, right? For me as an individual donor specialist, I know my talents are best executed in the space of mapping giving programs for individuals. That's where I excel in that strategy and relationship building, but I cannot do that without skilled prospect researchers and data scientists working alongside me using their talents of behavioral analytics to collaborate on that strategy and relationship building. From an equity standpoint, the interesting thing that that I find fascinating in this conversation is that in the for-profit sector, we see a lot of investment in that level of creative talent. This is honestly a conversation that I recently had via a Hive chat, right? Is that we see investment in creative talent in the for-profit sector, and unfortunately, due to scarcity mindset, we do not see that investment in the nonprofit sector. And I would truly lean into that equity conversation around making sure that you operationally have what you need to achieve your goals.
Absolutely. I love that. Betsy, what would you add to this piece of conversation?
I would agree. The short answer is no. I've never worked in higher ed. The largest development shop I've worked in, we were 14, which I know is very big compared to many. I've also never been a shop of one. The smallest I've been in, I was one of two, or one of three. So I think where you go from the no depends on the organization you're at. And the willingness of executive leadership and the board to listen. So if it's a slightly bigger staff, and to Christina's point, well, you're not doing all of this, you're directing all of this, how to make sure that you are empowered to hire the right people under you to fill in the gaps of your expertise. So my background is the vertical has been individual giving. I've done grant writing, I've overseen grant writing, but the organization would be best served if one of my direct reports is the primary grant writer and I can lead on major gifts. That's not possible at smaller organizations where there isn't a full team under the director of development. So where I'd want to go from there is how can you deputize people who aren't in the development department to help you? This is sort of the next step of building a culture of philanthropy. If there's an admin assistant who is doing work in the database anyway, can they help with data entry? Can they help with, the tax receipts, that sort of thing? If there's program staff, can you make them a de facto major gifts officer? They hold some of those relationships. Maybe you as the director of development are still making the asks, but how can you share that load amongst the non-development staff? Of course, all that not having receptive leadership and a receptive board, but I think it's worth a try.
I find that really interesting about the engagement of all those different people. And I know there's a couple people in the comments who are going, team of one, which is the reality for lots of nonprofits, right? Across the board, 80% are very small shop nonprofits. And so you may end up with that director of development role, which I know Christina and I initially were part of the joke in a conversation, I have it recorded, is the title director of development just the most misunderstood role in nonprofit? Because how can it be the same title that can be held at multiple organizations? And you said director of advancement too, Betsy. I think a lot of us aren't really sure what it means when somebody says that is their title, because it could cover so many different pieces. And I really like your mention too of culture of philanthropy, because Christina, you had a post, and I think it was about that ridiculous role and what do they mean by culture of philanthropy here? Because I don't know that that's really defined. I love your definition, Betsy, that would be a culture of philanthropy, but I don't know that that's always what they mean in a role. And I remember people saying, Christina, on that post, does that mean we have to bring all of our own donors with us? And that's part of what the culture of philanthropy means. I don't know. I'd love your take on that term, because I get confused by hearing those words. That seems like a loaded term to me.
I think that the organizations that want somebody to bring in and institute a culture of philanthropy have no idea what that means. A culture of philanthropy is exactly what Betsy said. It's an engaged board. I'm looking at Angela's comments, but engaged board, staff, a lot of donors, a heavy pipeline. A culture of philanthropy is somebody on your program staff saying, hey, I heard you mention in the team meeting that you're meeting with a donor who's interested in X program today. Do you want me to meet with you or even join that conversation so that I can provide some information you might not have? And a culture of philanthropy is one in which the goal for the organization, the fundraising goal, is one that everybody in the team has buy-in on. It's one in which when you do have a development team of 1 or 2 or a small shop, everybody on staff is folding napkins before the gala instead of the development person who's there doing this all by themselves with the, venue staff, right? It's an all hands on deck. Our organization can only succeed by raising money. And so together, we are all going to raise money. It's having an administrative assistant who processes tax receipts. It's more importantly to what Betsy said earlier, building up younger staff. Sometimes I think I was once hired as the first full-time development hire, and that was a disaster because they had no idea what they needed. And I remember thinking, you really should have just promoted up this younger staff member who has been doing so much of this work. Promote them up, give them the proper training and resources, and give them some mentorship and let them learn how to be a fundraiser. But there is this, we don't promote up, we don't promote within, we always just hire externally. And I think one of the biggest things when it comes to having a culture of philanthropy is whether an organization is actually ready to hire full-time development staff. Yes. Because if you have a culture of philanthropy that already exists within your organization, your development staff is coming in primed to start doing what they need to do to raise money. You've got a pipeline in place. You've got program officers who maybe have, especially for smaller shops, program officers who have been writing their own grants that are looking for somebody to take on that load instead of somebody who's going to come in and teach the whole staff how to fundraise and then be told, no, this is your job. We hired you to do this. You need to stay in your lane. Everybody else needs to stay in their respective lanes. And then you create these silos, which just creates this environment that nobody can thrive in.
I think this is such a brilliant place to move into that next piece. And I know we talked about it a little bit before this started, but Betsy, I'm going to have you start this because fundraisers and financial decisions, like what happens when fundraisers are left out of key financial decisions like budgeting? Like how does that work when the people who are supposed to bring in the money are left out of big decisions about budgeting and how we're going to accomplish that as a team?
It doesn't work. It means that the budgets are completely untethered from reality, is the short answer. I think that the revenue and expense conversations have to happen, at least where I've worked and where it's worked well, they happen simultaneously and then the roads converge. And then maybe they do this again when you try to fix things and then they come back together. But you never want a scenario where, whether it's the executive director, the chair of the board, whoever is responsible, the CFO says, we need you to raise $1 million. And you say, wait a minute, we brought in 500 this year, $500,000 this year. I can't, I don't have the pipeline to get to $1 million. And they say, well, that's how much it costs to run. You are being set up, not just you are being set up for failure, the organization is being set up for failure.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, this is part of why this conversation got started, because the number of people I have heard through Hive chats, through DMs, all of that was fundraisers going, by some miracle, we hit our goal last year. And now we've been told to increase it by 20%. We have no idea how we even did it the first time because we have no time to figure that out. And the board just comes in and goes, 20% increase. Like businesses don't, for-profit businesses would not go, hey, sales team, 20% increase. Figure that out, right? Like there seems to be some sort of quirky disconnect and I don't totally understand it. Marina, what would you add to that part of the conversation?
I mean, honestly, I feel like when we disconnect our creative teams that are responsible for facilitating our contributed revenue from the teams that manage those streams of income, we are legitimately building operational dams, right? We're building operational dams that harm, internal and external impact, right? And this for me a little bit ties back into that conversation around culture of philanthropy. Why? Because, because again, culture of philanthropy is such sort of a nebulous term. I like to use contributed income, friends. When we bring the rest of our teams along the way, realizing, contributed income is important. It means that, like, when I worked in animal welfare, the admissions team knew that when a pet came in, that from the moment they came in, if they had a really strong and powerful story, they would reach out to the development office, right? Because they knew that that story could have some incredible impact, and it was one that we would want to follow, because they knew shared investment and contributed revenue. You know what I mean? For me, that's the piece that I think is really interesting when we think about how we connect both our development teams and our finance teams, and again, give our staff a little bit more buy-in. And again, back to the corporate sector, in retail, we empower retail staff to think creatively, how to display, how to, whatnot, or we invest in people to design those things. In the nonprofit sector, we more often than not do not.
And Tasha, if I may, I think that it's sort of the empowering your the program staff, admissions, or for us, we just got an email this morning. We're having some of our antique tapestries cleaned. I want that documented. We could raise money off of that, and I want our teams to think about all of their work in that way. And we have to be very clear that the tail is not wagging the dog here. You're not doing your work so the fundraisers can fundraise.
Correct.
The fundraisers fundraise so you can do your work, but we need to be able to tell that story.
I love that. And I mean, as a person, my background is marketing, right? Like the number one thing so often, and I think in general, marketing is a whole other, we could do another LinkedIn live on that, because that's a whole other dog's breakfast. But I do feel like there's so many times I'm dying to grasp the stories and help support that then moves potentially sales, fundraising, all of those things forward. But, that collection piece, that communal, like, the program delivery person did this, and now I need that story, right? Like, how do I get that story from them that then helps move that piece forward? So that siloed, piece is enormous. And I don't think we account for how much impact that has when we are functioning in silos, because I think it's pretty big. Christina, do you have any additional pieces to add to the financial decisions and fundraisers?
Yeah, there's so much more that could be said on this. One short note to what you just said is please, please, please invite your development staff to see your programs in action. I don't care if you are a US based team and your programs are elsewhere. They cannot tell stories unless they see these things happening. It is so imperative to them being able to do their job well, but that often isn't the case because it's an expense. And I think the biggest problem we have is that fundraisers are seen as a necessary evil as opposed to a strategic investment. Mm-hmm. And when you have, amidst record high inflation, an election year here in the US, which we know is, people are tightening up their purse strings a little bit because they don't know what's going to happen with this election. Yet organizations are sitting here saying, we're going to increase our goal for next year by 25%. Companies, retail companies are not doing that. They're sitting here saying, well, we've got to brace because we might not do as well with holiday sales as we normally do. And when fundraisers are seen as a necessary expense, the risk to that is these job descriptions that say this position is expected to double our revenue in 1 to 3 years with no pipeline. Instead of, when Tasha and I first connected, we were talking about how, performance tied to revenue really shouldn't be a thing for at least 18 months. I just hired somebody in my staff as a digital marketing person. A digital fundraising person. We don't have a digital fundraising person. I said, this is what we raised last year. This is what we've raised to date this year. It's been a tremendous increase. I want you to figure out what you think we can reasonably achieve next year. And if you hit that number, great. If you don't, maybe we set the bar a little too high, or maybe other factors went into play that prohibited us from doing that. But I was very clear that you not hitting this goal that I am asking you as the person responsible to set that goal, you not hitting it is not a measure of your performance. It's a measure of a conversation we need to have. And that is not happening. Correct. Fundraisers are hired into these roles expected to double, triple revenue with this. If you don't raise this, your job is on the line. And it's not an investment. Whereas when you have a director of development staff turnover, donors are losing trust. And then how can anybody walk into a conversation with somebody for the first time and know I have to close this potential $50,000 gift in the next 6 months and build a relationship with them, or I'm going to lose my job? That creates unnecessary pressure, and the donors are going to feel it. And it's just creating this vicious cycle that is substantially harming the entire sector.
So I'm going to shout her out. I don't know if she's still in the chat, but Karis Chenery, an amazing executive director out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. I just did a Hive interview with her the other day. So I'm shouting her out because one of the critical things she said, they serve children in the community, and they've got this wonderful after-school program that they run. And one of the things she noted, because her team, she's been there for over 20 years. She's got team members that have been there for 15 and more years. One of the things she noted is that the children expect consistency. They come because they know who's going to be there and who is talking about them, and they have that interaction. And one of the things we miss out on is thinking about fundraiser attrition, and when people leave after building up relationships there, Karis has showed you out, and what happens when impact is going to take a hit when we lose people. It does, the trust part of that. And I wonder how that plays into this whole nonprofits are less trusted than for-profits. Like, what does that mean? And is this kind of one of those components where we're not taking into account when we lose people who have built relationships? What does that say about our nonprofit as well, right? And it's great when somebody got a better role, but how do you explain, oh, they didn't increase by 20%? Like, that, I don't think any donor is going to accept that as a reason. I don't know. That's my take, at least. Marina, you look like you had something to say on that.
Well, I think there's several things here, right? Like there's the part where we as an industry are obsessed with only positive outcomes. We have a fear of reporting and actually saying to our donors and our communities, we are struggling. This is where we need your help, even though that's really the thing that we should be saying. Right. I think there's a little bit of that's interesting to me. And also the other thing that I think is interesting is that unfortunately, I feel like some of this, our impossible goals, there's a link to our deeply disparate economy. I feel like there's something interesting about how, the nonprofit sector, we already know how much our organizations are fighting for seemingly fewer dollars. We know that's a lie. There's actually more money out there than ever before, right? We're fighting for dollars. But what we don't talk about enough, I feel like, is the wealth gap in terms of our own employees' pay and benefits sector-wide, and how those intersect with record disparities in income versus cost of living.
Yeah.
Right. And so here we are pushing our staff for more and more and more. And human beings are just fighting to survive.
Yeah, I totally agree. Karis, thanks for letting me share a little bit of your story. It's coming out later, but Karis just, I really hit the nail on the head there when we were having that chat. And I think this brings us, we could continue on about this for so long because there's so many points here. And I think we're going to end up in an overhead conversation, which is a future LinkedIn Live we clearly need to have. But, we've talked about some of the challenges, some of the problems. Marina, do you want to start us off with like those practical steps we could start to take as leaders, as directors of development ourselves, like, or our executive directors above us? Like, what are those steps we can start to take?
Top of line, obviously investing in creative talent, and being willing to be creative, even if it involves failure, right? Just for the sake of learning. I also think that the nonprofit space is and always has been a place where industry pilots things, and then they go into for-profit sector and become too expensive for nonprofits to access. In terms of a lot of products and services, we see it happen all the time, but nonprofits are also a great place where we can pilot, and are already, many nonprofits are doing 4-day, 32-hour week, full-time salary benefits, right? Additional stipends, in addition to phone and internet stipend. I had an employer that had an incredible family care stipend where every employee could submit receipts up to I think it was $650 a month for costs incurred to providing care that impacted your ability to focus on your job. And we intentionally did not define what family care looks like, because we know, especially in communities of color, it could be a parent-child caretaking relationship. It may not. I had a direct report who they did caretaking for their grandmother and submitted receipts every month for the costing, that it incurred.
I like that. That's pretty innovative. I have never heard of anybody doing that. So I love that comment. Betsy, what would you add? Practical steps.
I like that, the creative ways above and beyond an appropriate salary to show that your staff, that they are appreciated. I also like, Tasha, your suggestion not to be afraid to fail. I would add a suggestion from the other side, which is don't be afraid to say no sometimes. Don't be afraid to say no to taking on a new program or to launching a new initiative, because you want to make sure that you have the bandwidth, both in terms of what your staff can handle and what your finances can handle, to take that on. And sometimes that's hard. It's, when you're writing grants, you want to show that you're growing, that you're expanding, that you reached 100 kids last year, but this year it's going to be 150. And I think some of that requires shifting your definition of success. Do we really need to reach more kids? Or is it just we need to reach these kids more deeply? And what would that look like? Being creative about the markers of success, the metrics that you set up for yourself, and making sure that you're measuring yourself against metrics that work for your organization, not for what a grantor requires or what another organization that does something similar advertises.
Oh, I love this. Angela coming in, setting boundaries is a must.
Absolutely.
And I think nonprofits struggle with boundaries because how can we get the funding in the door? Whatever, right? Like the whole system is kind of set up. There's a couple, Dan's coming in with some great examples here too. I really, I think there's something to be said that right now as a society, we're looking for depth over breadth. And I think that applies to our donors and our potential partners as well. I think there is a little bit of a less is more, but it's less is more knowing that you're going to go deeper on some of those relationships, and that meaningful relationships, I think, are going to trump all of the rest of it, especially moving forward, because it's so noisy. There's so much noise, right? So how can you kind of go deeper on those relationships? Christina, what would you add as a practical step?
I love that Marina and Betsy have both taken two very different approaches to this, because they're both so critical. Marina, you talked about taking care of your people and within. I mean, I love that your organization offered that benefit, because we cannot do our jobs well if we are not well at home. And so many people are still feeling the very real lingering effects of the pandemic, in terms of increased caregiving responsibilities, in terms of isolation, in terms of mental and physical health challenges. And so I think everything Marina said is something I agree with. And Betsy, you too, setting boundaries. I'm going to speak a little bit, more practically. And the first thing I want to say before I jump in is I understand, for those of you who are on this call who have either left a job because of everything we've talked about, who set all of your goals and were laid off anyway, and you are looking for work. I hear you. I see you. I am sorry. And I know that what I'm about to lay out might seem scary and unreasonable for somebody who is really kind of desperate for their next thing. But I think it starts with challenging those 30-point descriptions and walking into an interview and saying, this position has a high level of responsibility. In your view, to say to the hiring manager, what are the top 4 things that this person needs to focus on to truly be successful and drive this organization forward? And force them to narrow that down to the way that I said it earlier. And then if you're in an organization and you have 40 different responsibilities, really sitting down and saying, here's our pipeline, right? If you're left out of budgeting conversations and you know that your organization starts budgeting for the next fiscal year in October of every year, then in July, start making your own revenue projections. Start looking at, we raise this money from grants, we raise this much from individuals, we raise this much from peer-to-peer, and do your own revenue projection and mapping, and sit down with your supervisor, get a conversation with the board if you can. And I know that's challenging because I have been a director of development who wasn't allowed to talk to the board, but sit down with your supervisor and say, this is what I think we can reasonably raise next year based on the information we have available. Next year, the Jane Doe Foundation is going to end their 3-year grant and they're sunsetting. So that's not something that we can count on again next year. That's a $250,000 gap that we are going to have to fill, that I'm hoping we can do so with X, Y, and Z organizations, but it's a $250,000 gap that I think we need to budget accordingly for, right? And sometimes you just have to take these things into your own hands. And good leaders will hear that and appreciate that. And you can say, and I would like the opportunity to present this information to the board so that when they're setting these goals, we have a seat at the table as what we can realistically tell them. Because sometimes leaders, EDs and CEOs of nonprofits, their hands are tied as well from what's coming down from the board. So I think there are ways that we just have to take so much ownership over that to try to set ourselves up for success. And it's a strong way of setting these kinds of boundaries. I think one thing that I remember, I walked into a role that said, we want you to raise X amount of money in new grant revenue in 12 months. I said, the average life cycle of a grant is 9 to 12 months. Yeah. I can apply for 50 grants today and not hear from a single one of them 12 months from now. We might get every single one of them, but I won't know if we've gotten any of them for at least 12 months. And these are the things that people have to realize. And when I said that, leadership was floored. Like, they could not believe that what I was telling them was true. And this is the piece, organizations love to talk about donor education. We have to educate our donors about what we have to do. Well, if we're educating our donors, we need to educate our teams about what is realistic. And sometimes, I hate to say the burden of responsibility falls to us because we are doing so much. But if you are in one of these roles, the burden of responsibility does fall to you to take the initiative and take the ownership of trying to educate your team so that you're not responsible for these many things, so that the next fundraiser that is hired, so that more leaders are coming into conversations like this and more board members are coming into conversations like this and saying, oh, that's it. I saw a comment of somebody asked if there's a handout that they can give to boards and leaders. And it's something that I've been really thinking about creating, because I think the people who are here in this conversation, right? If I could see everybody, I'd say, raise your hand if you're a fundraiser. And like 95% of this conversation is probably fundraisers. So that's something I do want to work with Tasha on, is like, can we create a resource that give this to your boards and your leaders about what's actually happening? But I do think some of this is going to have to fall to us.
Yeah, it's so funny that you started to say that, because I was like, Christina, I feel like Philanthropy could create a toolkit on this. This sounds very
it's on my list.
It's on your list. Sorry, Marina, did you start to say something there?
No. I was just nodding and in deep agreement. That's all.
Betsy.
I do want to acknowledge, I see a comment from another Marina in the chat about how is someone in leadership not know anything about grants. When I was a baby intern wanting to go into nonprofit, my supervisor told me, if you want to be a nonprofit executive at some point in your career, the fastest way to do that is through development. And so that's what I did. I became a fundraiser because I knew if I ever wanted to lead a nonprofit on my own, I was choosing the path that would fast track me to nonprofit leadership. And that's not happening anymore. Organizations are increasingly, and boards are hiring from outside the sector to bring somebody with fresh eyes. And they're coming from the private sector and think that they can run a nonprofit the same way they're running their companies. Or they're people who burned out of the private sector and just really want to do good, but they have no idea. They think that raising level, I don't even know these terminologies, level A, seed funding, investments is the same thing as writing grants. And it's not. It's just not. And I know so many development staff who are applying for ED roles or asking to be promoted into ED roles when their EDs are leaving, and they're not getting them. Development staff are no longer moving into executive leadership. And I think that that's a problem.
Yeah.
Betsy, did you have something you wanted to jump in on there?
I did something actually that Christina said earlier about, educating your team starting in July and creating your own forecast and being able to show the work. I think when it comes to that, it's also important to recognize the role that we as directors of development, or whatever the title may be, play as nonprofit leadership. And I think it's important to be transparent in the other direction too. Show your team, if you have direct reports, show your team how you did that work.
Correct.
Show your team how you expect to get to the goals that you've set, if you're able to, the goals that executive leadership has set. If you have major gifts officers under you or an annual fund manager, when you do your weekly check-ins with them, how are you working towards the goal that you laid out for yourself that we both know is realistic? So it's not that necessarily that there are things happen, working towards goals in parallel, but that you're always able to show your work. Your team, the team that reports up to you, knows that you're being realistic about what they can accomplish, even if you have to try to translate into something else for executive leadership.
Oh man.
Agreed. I'll say the spaces where I have been the most successful were the spaces where my bosses empowered me, gave me the opportunity to not only build my revenue generation plan, but also my expense plan. You know what I mean? Like included me, the person actually executing the program, in the process. And for some reason, we have gotten away from that practice.
This is the chat is on fire over here, guys. Like, it's amazing. They're all talking back and forth. This is so fantastic. One of my other ones was, and I know, Marina, you started to touch in on this with key changes organizations can take. I loved your creative angle on how to support teams and like that kind of end. Is there any other things at like more of the organizational level? So maybe leaders can't, and I think Betsy, you even spoke to it just now. There's a teaching that should be internally happening all the time within your own team. And I think so often, and nonprofiteers are already overwhelmed. Like, every time somebody says to me, oh, we're going to build a new course, I'm like, when does anybody have time to take that? Like, I don't know where people are supposed to have learning time to do that. So I wonder if there is like that culture of learning internally and what can we teach each other that maybe just isn't happening often enough. And there's this constant look to external experts for that. Christina, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, it's funny. Somebody asked me, I see Amina in here.
Yeah.
Hi, Amina. We met at a conference last year, and it was the Women in Philanthropy conference. And it was the first professional development conference I had ever been to. Nobody had ever paid for me to go to a conference before. The reason I don't have a CFRE is because nobody has been willing to pay for one for me, right? And it's something that I didn't want to have to pay for on my own. I think courses are great if people are going to pay for them, but we have fundraisers operating on shoestring budgets with no professional development. It's one of the reasons I joined the Hive chat is because learning from one another is just so crucial. And I've only been active on LinkedIn for the last year or so. And I love the conversation around, I don't know how to do this. Who can you put me in touch with that is teaching me? And there's just this really lovely community of people who are willing to help each other out without any kind of like quid pro quo. And I think leaning into a community like that is really, really important. If you are not already joining the Hive chat, like please start to do so, because it's really an invaluable way to not only learn what other cool people are doing in this sector, but also to just troubleshoot and vent and feel supported. I think we do really need to prioritize continuous learning, right? There is a phenomenal digital marketing fundraising expert named Jess Campbell. Her company is out in the boons, and I've met her. I've like worked with her. We kind of have the same client. Her email newsletter, she offers tons of materials that you can pay for, but her email newsletter has taught me more about digital fundraising than anything I have ever learned. And through her alone, my digital fundraising has taken off to levels that I never, ever would have imagined. And so look out for the people like that who are offering free resources, and sign up for their newsletters and learn where you can, but also push for professional development within your organizations. I mean, I feel like I didn't want this conversation to be push for more. But there is just a lot of, we are so tired, but there's also, we have so much yearning to do good. It's why we do this work. We joined the animal welfare organization because we have a deep passion for supporting the rights of animals. We joined, the youth music organization because we were a youth who was handed a clarinet at the age of 12, and it completely changed our lives. Like, non-profiteers are just fundamentally good-natured people. And I think the reason why these roles are so challenging is because we don't sit there and say, that's unrealistic, I quit. We sit there and say, well, that seems unrealistic, but I'm going to do everything I can to try to reach that goal. And that's the piece that I wish more people understood, is that when we sit there and say, I don't think this goal is feasible, it's not because we don't want to do it. It's because we desperately want to do it, and we know we're going to burn ourselves out trying.
Correct.
I love that. What would you add, Betsy, on that organizational level? And yeah, it's hard. I don't want to make it sound like there's all these things that all the fundraisers have to do to fix their teams necessarily, but what else would you add?
I think looking inwards towards the organization, if you work somewhere where there's a monthly all staff, ask to give a presentation about what you do at the all staff. Whether you're the one leading as the director of development, or you want to deputize someone on your team to give that, but so that your colleagues don't think that all you do is go to lunches and plan parties. What exactly do you do? How do you do it? What are these, the skills and the expertise that's needed? Why do you need their help? I think that's big. You said something about stuffing envelopes earlier. And one of my first jobs, when I had my first mass mailing, our executive director, we were a full-time team of 8, and the executive director said, send an email around so everyone knows that you will be using the conference table from, 12 to 5, stuffing envelopes, and invite people to join you if you have some time. Okay. So I sent an email around. I'll be using the conference table from 12 to 5, stuffing envelopes. If you have a minute, stop by. And I think I brought some candy or something as an incentive. The executive director sat with us for 3 hours and stuffed envelopes with us. I mean, that made a huge difference, just showing that everyone's involved. Everyone understands what goes into this, from sending out a mailing to a few thousand people to having those one-on-ones at a lunch when it's a major donor. I think there's that angle to the teaching as well. We need to learn and we need to teach our colleagues. So the more executive leadership can empower you to do that, to show that you are trusted and show that you are an expert, the easier, hopefully, it will be to do your job.
I love, I think this is Jennifer. It keeps saying LinkedIn user, but I think this is Jennifer Creedy, but debunking fundraising from within helps the team feel better. And I think that's just so true, right? Like, is there a bunch of mythology around fundraising? And just like every field, post-COVID, it's wildly different out here. Things are changing fast for teams. And I don't think any of us are having the time or brain space to go, well, my job is intensely different since AI, since COVID, since the fact that like work-life boundaries have totally changed with remote work. Like we're not given time to realize how that might change our team dynamics as well, for sure. Marina, any last additional items here on the organizational level?
The only other thing that I was honestly, I don't remember which one of y'all said something that reminded me. One of my cousins works in, in corporate world as an executive for a makeup brand. And I remember she was telling me a few months ago that I don't remember if it's every other week or once a month, organization wide, they institute a learning day where there are no meetings scheduled, no one, and it's a day where every employee is encouraged to, if it's webinars, if it's an in-person class, and they're really clear on it, doesn't even have to be directly work related. If you need to do a pottery class or whatever, but they institutionalized a monthly. No one's going to be on screen. We're not going to schedule anything. This is just a personal growth day as part of their corporate culture. And I would love to see stuff like that more included in our sector.
I love that. I mean, I've never worked anywhere in for-profit that's ever done anything like that, but it sounds amazing.
Kendo Brands, friend. That's where my cousin works for Kendo. So just, I hear they're a great place to work. Could be all lies.
That's amazing. Anybody have any additional things to say? Because we are already over time, my friends.
I think I want to add I'm so grateful to everybody who came here, but I love that we each brought and Tasha is just amazing for bringing 3 people with 3 very different perspectives together. And I love that, Marina, I love how much of the personnel piece that you added, because it is so critical, right? Tasha and I have talked about this, and Betsy as well, but I have been mulling over nonprofits and parents and burnout, and what is the Venn diagram of what that looks like, and how much of us are burned out because of our caregiving responsibilities, and how much are burned out because of our jobs, and what's the intersection of that. And I mean, that will be coming soon, but I hope that this conversation has been practical. I hope that some of us can come and start with making these small changes, right? Advocating for a quarterly what did you call it? Learning development.
Yeah, personal
right?
thing. These are ways, this is how we operationalize equity, friends.
Yes. And then you can watch all of the webinars that you signed up for, that you have starred in your inbox and haven't deleted, because one day you're going to get to them.
That are all recorded that we didn't attend live. Let's be real.
Oh my goodness. And same thing I was going to say, side comment for all of you who didn't make this entire thing. It is recorded and will be on YouTube, because I realize half of the people who signed up didn't get to watch this in real time. I'm so sad for you, because the comments section, the people who are here, all 3 of you, just thanks for, I reached out to you and was like, I think this is a real thing. Christina and I want to do this. And you guys just jumped in, open arms. And I think this industry needs real talk conversations, and they are going to be uncomfortable, but until it's just that moving of the needle, just a little bit all the time. And how can we do that? And so you guys are brilliant. You started this off. I'm just so thankful to all 3 of you. For people who are in the comments here watching, follow these wonderful humans and the work they're doing, because it's brilliant. And they're, jump in on the conversation, get your voice heard, because I think that's where things change, is when it's every person needs to start talking about it. And then that's when it's probably going to go, oh, it's not just, Christina on her cool post talking about ridiculous fundraisers role. It's no, everybody's talking about this. This is a thing, right? Because I think it's those outliers right now that maybe leadership is sometimes going, oh, this is an outlier saying this. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think it's a lot of us. So you guys have been amazing. For anyone checking this out, I'm trying to keep some of these rolling. We are talking about nonprofits and innovation in a couple of weeks with Lee Kroll. If you guys haven't checked out her book, I would highly recommend. She's amazing. And this was us talking about overloaded roles and, fundraising. And thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. You're incredible humans. And I'm so thankful you guys are the fundraisers out there in the world making a difference. So
thank you, Dasha.
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Thanks, everyone.